This is the Good Fire Podcast. Stories of Indigenous fire stewardship, cultural empowerment, and environmental integrity. Hey everybody, welcome to Good Fire. My name is Matthew Kristoff.
And I'm Amy Cardinal Christensen, and we're here to share stories of Indigenous fire stewardship.
So over the next few episodes, we're going to be talking with Indigenous researchers and Indigenous fire practitioners about what they're doing and how they're trying to get Indigenous burning back on the land.
So this podcast is sponsored by the Canadian Partnership for Wildland Fire Science, with support from the California Indian Water Commission and the Fire Sticks Alliance Indigenous Corporation. Okay, so on this episode, we have Professor Jay Mistry. She's a professor of environmental geography at Royal Holloway, the University of London. So Jay's here to talk to us today about her work in South America on Indigenous fire stewardship.
So awesome. Thanks a lot for coming on, Jay. We're looking forward to this. It should be good. And maybe you can just introduce yourself and tell us where you're from and what your work is like.
Yeah, so my name is Jay Mistry. I'm a professor in environmental geography in the Department of Geography at Royal Holloway, University of London in the UK. And I'm originally, I'm British. Well, I don't know if that's useful to know, but I'm of Asian origin. So my grandparents are originally from India, but my parents were brought up in Kenya in Africa. So I have a kind of mixed heritage kind of background.
Oh, neat.
Oh, that's cool. So how did you get into looking into cultural burning and Indigenous fire stewardship?
Yeah, I suppose I did my undergraduate degree in biology at the University of London and another college at King's College. And from there, I was kind of recommended, I wanted to do a PhD, and I was recommended to do one at the School of Oriental and African Studies. This is also at the College of the University of London. And it was there that I kind of started getting interested in fire because my supervisor was a kind of fire expert, mostly in Southeast Asia, actually. And initially, I was actually going to be working in India, on the border between India and Burma, and I was going to look at fire and forest management over there. And it was just kind of a series of events that happened, including some civil unrest in the region, that I ended up going to Brazil. It's just a complete turnaround. But what
just
I was
the
actually
side of the planet, no big deal.
What I was going to actually look at wasn't actually working with people. I was very much focused on the vegetation. I was going to kind of look at the impacts of fire on the vegetation itself and how the vegetation responded to different types of fire. So kind of, fire frequency, fire history. It was very much an ecological type of project. And so that's what I kind of did. I lived in Brazil for a year. I did a lot of field work, which just involved really talking to nobody, and just doing a lot of plant measuring. And I was working within a nature reserve. And obviously, I started seeing all these fires entering the reserve and burning through these experimental plots. So I was working in an area where they were like experimental plots. They set them on fire at different times, and then you went and different students came and they kind of studied ants responses, or in my case, I was looking at lichens and how lichens responded on the trees and whether that could tell you about what kind of fire history there was and so forth. But these fires were entering, and people were kind of saying, yeah, those people that burn, they're really careless, and they all these people that live around the reserve, and I kind of started thinking, well, who are these people that live around the reserve? I never met them, and people just seem to talk quite bad about them. And so when I finished my PhD, or towards the end, I started kind of trying to find out about it, and then I came back to the UK to write up my thesis. And as I was doing that and finishing off, I just managed to get a little bit more funding. And I went back to actually try to engage with the people that kind of lived around the reserve. And I started first actually working with small farmers, so subsistence farmers, because they were the ones that were actually on the periphery of the nature reserve. And I kind of looked at why small farmers were burning, the kind of burning that they did, what kind of challenges they had, why they chose to burn and not to do other things. And a lot of it was related to poverty. A lot of it was related to not having a choice, actually, in the kinds of management that they could do on their farms. And I suppose as I started doing more and more reading, I came across a lot of the literature about Indigenous burning in Australia, particularly. And a lot of the things that the farmers were telling me, because in Brazil, there's such a mixed, their heritage, it's so mixed, and they have a lot of Amerindian influence in their families. And actually a lot of the burning practices, or the things that they were telling me about why they did certain types of burn, kind of corresponded to some of the literature I was reading on Indigenous burning in Australia. So I kind of started thinking, okay, it'd be really interesting to find out a little bit more about Indigenous burning in Brazil. And that's how I kind of, I made some contacts. I tried to find out, and then got some more funding and went back and did my first project, which was with a group called the Kraor, which is, they live in the state of Tocantins, which is in the kind of southern part of the Amazon basin. So that was a kind of my first kind of encounter with kind of looking at how they did burning. So that's how that was my very short journey into how I got to Indigenous fire management.
That's cool. So just for context, all the other people that we've talked to have been from Australia, United States, and we're both from Canada. So we're very, everything's very fire dependent ecosystems, right?
Yeah.
What is the situation down in Brazil? Is it as fire dependent? Is the Amazon as fire dependent as Australia and the States and Canada, or is it different?
Because
system?
because I suppose I did my research in the savannas. So if you look at Australia, particularly in the Northern Territory, that's all savanna, and I did my research in savannas too. And actually, most of the burning that I was looking at with the Kraor was within the savannas. So what they do is they live in the savannas, but they would be doing farming, for example, in the forest, patches of forest, in the forest fragments. So a lot of indigenous groups in South America, that's what they do. Not, the ones that if they live in the savannah, they don't farm in the savannah. They'll be farming in forest patches along rivers or up in the mountains, or wherever it might be, in these like little islands of forest. So in the forest, they'll do their farming, which they'll use fire as well. So they'll do like rotational farming. They'll, cut a small piece of land, and then they'll burn it. They'll plant, and then after a number of years, they'll move on to another patch. And then in the savannah is where they also burn, but they burn in a different way to the way that they would burn on their farm. So they'd be burning for things like hunting, gathering fruits, gathering other kinds of resources like palms, nuts, oil, nuts for oil and things like that. Hunting, like I said, hunting is quite a big thing. So they kind of hunt either individually or in big groups as well, depending on what it's for. So fire is used in different ways in the different ecosystems. And so like even in the Amazon basin, it's not just all forest, it's actually a very mosaic landscape of savannas and forests and wetlands. So fire being used in different, and even in the wetlands, basically people would be using fire at certain times of the year as well, when it's dry enough to burn.
Yeah, great. So Jay, when were you doing your kind of first project in Brazil? Because I'm just wondering what, the relationship was like then between the Indigenous peoples there that were burning and the agency.
Yeah, so I suppose that time when I was working, you're talking about kind of like the late 1990s. And the relationship wasn't very good at all. You're talking about an era of what we call zero fire, which was this whole idea that fire is not a good thing. We've got to stop it. And we basically it's all about firefighting and preventing fire from happening. So Indigenous burning wasn't really seen as a good thing necessarily. To tell you the truth, even though it's quite an interesting issue, because I know you said that you've read some of the papers that I've written and about workshops we've held where we've tried to bring people together and talk about this issue. And although there is, I think within government agencies, a real move towards changing the paradigm and from zero fire to thinking about active fire management, because they're realizing that they can't fight fires anymore. They realize it just hasn't been successful. It's too big of an issue for them to do it. So they've got to think of another way of doing it. There's still a very big lobby in places like Brazil, particularly, to kind of, what would you say? I suppose to kind of villainize Indigenous people as kind of degrading the environment through the use of fire. And that's basically the kind of agro-business. So the very big agro-business lobby and farmers who are have a lot of power in Brazil, particularly with the current government that there is there at the moment. So they still put those messages out that Indigenous people, do still degrade the land, and that they use fire in a, without a good kind of motives or reckless way. So it's kind of a kind of interesting time at the moment in a place like Brazil, where a lot of the people in the government agencies, and I think in the conservation agencies, are kind of moving towards being kind of more open to thinking about how to use Indigenous fire management. And they've had a few programs actually that have been actually trying some things out, while at the same time you've got these huge kind of agro-business lobbies that are kind of saying, no, we've got to assimilate, in inverted commas, Indigenous people into Brazilian society, and those things they do are not very good, and their practices are like backward practices and all that kind of stuff. So like Brazil is a really interesting case at the moment because of this kind of strange thing going on with politics there.
Yeah.
So the wildfire situation, just for more context, just so everyone understands, myself included in that, is the wildfire situation in Brazil equally as troublesome as it is like in North America and Australia? It's kind of run rampant at this point.
Yeah, I think so. I suppose the reason why you don't probably hear about it so much is that I think in a lot of parts of North America, you see fire coming very close to urban centers.
Right.
And so that's where we suddenly see it in the news over here as well, because it's on the outskirts of some town somewhere, or the town is burnt down. Whereas in places like Brazil, it just rages in landscapes for weeks and weeks and weeks, maybe months. You don't really hear about it, but it's just as catastrophic, and they're just as large scale going on over there as well. They're huge fires that go on.
Okay, so there is a lot of fear around wildfire, and so it's easy for the media to push that agenda of fire is bad on the population.
Yeah. But I suppose it doesn't. It doesn't. So far, it hasn't come close to urban centers to the extent as it has in North America.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Because I think maybe it's just a different type of landscape. And maybe that's why it hasn't happened. And so therefore, I think that's why you don't have that big kind of media coverage of it.
Yeah, it's just so interesting to me, this pervasiveness of the, whole idea that Indigenous fire is bad. And I mean, throughout the world, almost like, we've seen examples of it in Canada, US, Australia, just on this podcast alone. But I mean, in Africa, in South America, and how the agencies, there's that whole zero fire, the fire suppression policies that have gone into place. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm just wondering too, if you can maybe talk about some of the work that you're doing in, I think the study that you did was at Ecuador and Brazil, that looked at, bringing together people to kind of find a way out of this, fire exclusion paradigm that we're currently in, to kind of getting Indigenous people and agencies to work better together.
Yeah, I suppose I have to correct you there, Amy, because it's actually Venezuela, not Ecuador.
Okay,
yeah,
sorry. Yep. Yeah,
perfect.
That's
my colleague
good.
Bibiana Bilbao will go, what?
Yeah, what's she talking about?
So
yeah.
I've kind of been working a lot with this colleague of mine, Dr. Bibiana Bilbao. She's from the University Simón Bolívar in Venezuela. And she has a very long history working in Venezuela with the Pemon, particularly in the southern part, in the savannas, close to the Brazilian border, looking at fire management. And she's actually done a lot of experimental studies that kind of try to show how Indigenous fire management and the practices that they have reduce fuel loads, and, the kind of stuff that we know from kind of looking at patch mosaic burning and so forth that Indigenous people do, she's tried to kind of show that in experimental plots as well. So we kind of got together a number of years ago, realizing that we had kind of similar interests and we're in the kind of same path. And we got some funding from an organization here in the UK called the British Academy. And the whole idea was to kind of make a case for Indigenous fire management, why government decision makers and people in government agencies should listen and take note of Indigenous fire management. And so we kind of did, looked at all the studies and put together a kind of big literature review. And then part of that project was to bring people together to talk about it. So we basically brought people together from Brazil, from Venezuela, and from Guyana, which is another country in the region where I have a long history of working, to come together in these kind of workshops. So we've had 2 big workshops. One was in Venezuela, and then the second one was in Brazil, where we brought these people together to talk about it. And yeah, I suppose it's the idea was to, I suppose the timing was quite good, because there was already a realization that something had to change within institutions, that it couldn't be business as usual, that something had to change. They're realizing that firefighting is not working. These fires continue to burn. They don't have resources to fight them. And so they need to look at a different model. And I think there was a lot of evidence being gathered around the world about how Indigenous practices, not just fire management, but other types of Indigenous practices, are actually sustaining biodiversity and reducing greenhouse gases and so forth. So I think we seem to be in the right place at the right time, and people were very willing to kind of come together and talk about it. So we organized these workshops, and there were kind of 3 main groups. So Indigenous kind of people, stroke leaders, people from government institutions that were related to different kinds of natural resource management, as well as firefighting, and then academics that kind of worked in the area from the different countries. And yeah, I mean, they were really interesting, I think, spaces to talk about fire. I think there was a lot of tension, I think, on between them. And I think a lot of that was to do with trust, because especially the Indigenous people were so wary of their history, not just with fire management, but other types of violence and oppression that they've experienced, to kind of have the trust in those government institutions that they are really going to listen properly to what they have to say. And I think, if nothing else, I think our workshops did a lot of that. It did a lot of building trust between, and building relationships between these different kind of groups. Because even with the academics, a lot of the Indigenous people didn't have trust with them either, because they saw academics as kind of just coming there and, getting the data that they wanted and going off and publishing their things, but not really making a case for them and their kind of way of life. So I think it was really good for that. And I think we came away and people were very willing and very kind of motivated to then meet again, as we did in Brazil. So that's great. I think, one of the interesting things to me about, the work that you did there and reading about it was about the discussion around almost the shared values, we would call them up here. So, you have these people coming in that have very opposite, or they feel like they have opposite opinions. So here we get like a lot of standoff between the First Nations and then the Wildfire Management Agency, because as Indigenous people, we feel like it's our inherent right to steward the land, and to manage the land by using fire, and that we don't, necessarily need the permission of an agency. So when, the agencies sometimes come to workshops and say like, oh, we're interested in working with you, lots of times Indigenous people get upset about that, because it's like, well, who cares if you're interested in working with us? It's what we should do anyways, or the role that we've been given by the creator. So when I was reading your paper about it, I just thought it was really interesting how you were talking about, even in the workshop, how you tried to resolve tensions that came up between, kind of those really diverse viewpoints, to kind of, that everybody wants a healthy forest that they can live off and use.
For sure, because this is a common thread that we've come across from everybody we've talked to, right? Is that tension between the Western society and the Indigenous society, right? And like that tension between them, and understandably so, right, from the Indigenous perspective, because of the mistreatment and all that kind of stuff. So
yeah, there was a really interesting conversation on Twitter the other day, and I mean, take Twitter for what it is, but they were talking there about the difference between where did the terms controlled burn versus prescribed burn come from. And they were saying that it was always before in the past called controlled burn, but then all of a sudden the agency started calling them prescribed burns. And the idea was that through a prescription that had to be given by an expert. So that eliminated Indigenous people or local people from burning, because, you know, when you put in that expert thing, it has to be a burn boss or somebody that then gives approval
right.
for that burn.
Yeah. I suppose I'm kind of thinking back about the workshops. I think one of the things that really helped us in our workshops, I think, was the fact that my colleague Bibiana and I have had and have still long-term relationships with those Indigenous people. So I think that was really important in terms of being a facilitator for that process of dialogue, because almost like you need like a one-step person to have trust in, to kind of open the door and say, okay, it's, you know, don't worry, we're here to make sure it's a safe space. We're not going to let, you know, anybody kind of just talk over you or, you know, talk down to you or whatever it is. I think that was really important. And especially some of the feedback that we got towards the end of those workshops was very much about how it was really important to have people like us as facilitators that they had known for a very long time, that they could trust those people. So it wasn't just about building, you know, we enabled the trust building as well process by the fact that we had already built trust with these people. You know, I don't know if I'm explaining myself very well there.
No,
but
that's a great point, because I see that over here too. Lots of times different agencies and other people will invite Indigenous people to workshops or other things, but they expect them, you know, to kind of act like, you know, kind of your normal agency person, you know, like just jump up at a meeting and say what they want to say. Whereas in our teachings here, especially for Indigenous people and elders, you don't really speak unless it's your turn to speak. And so sometimes they won't say anything for like a whole meeting, even though they probably have a lot to say, or they'll want to think about it and then come back to their point. And so I think that's a really important thing to make, is that, you know, if they felt like they could trust you to kind of be there for them, and, you know, that they wouldn't get overrun by the agency folks and the academics. I think that's great.
Yeah. And you're right about the time, because, you know, in most of the workshops we had, they were like 3 to 4 days long, which kind of gave people time to mull over things. And like you said, it was quite interesting now reflecting back on it. There were occasions where people didn't necessarily say things straight away, but, you know, towards the end of the workshop, they might have come out with something. So you're right in terms of people needing that time as well. You know, you can't just have a half-day workshop where you expect everybody to say whatever they, you know, to talk and, participate.
Yeah. So what was the end results of those workshops like? Because they were... what year were they held? And then like kind of what progress have you seen moving forward since then? Yeah.
So basically the first one, oh gosh, I need to go back now. I'm trying to think. I think the first one was in 2016 and the second one was in 2017. So the one in Venezuela was the first one in 2016 and 2017. And I suppose the things that what's happened from that were a number of different things. First of all, that so in Venezuela particularly, like I said, my colleague Bibiana Bilbao had already kind of done a lot of work before, but I suppose the workshops really kind of cemented the kind of ideas and the relationships. And in Venezuela, there's the head of the firefighting, the forest firefighters, because they have different types of forests, they'd have different types of firefighters. And the forest firefighters, his name is Miguel Matani, Captain Miguel Matani, because they're all part of the kind of military thing. But he is actually a real champion for Indigenous fire management. It's really unusual to find somebody in a kind of quite hierarchical institution like that, to be so open to stuff. And he was very much, he loved the workshops, and he was there, and, he was very kind of open to stuff. So one of the things that he wants to do is actually to do some exchanges between the forest firefighters and the Indigenous people, and the ones that know about firefighting and, using fire, to actually do a kind of exchange of knowledge between the different types of firefighting. So that's one of the things that we're trying to see how we can take that forward. And then the other thing in Venezuela is also that they don't actually have a national level. They don't really have a kind of plan for firefighting, or for fire management, I should say. And so one of the things that we've been trying to push is trying to see whether some of the ideas that came out of the workshops could be taken up at a more kind of national level in terms of thinking about fire management, and how those Indigenous practices could be incorporated into some of those kind of policies and plans. So that's kind of where we are with that. We're kind of a little bit stuck at the moment because you probably know that, the political situation in Venezuela is really bad. The economic situation is really bad. And safety is an issue. So we haven't been able to pursue that too much, even though we keep in close contact with our colleagues there. But we're hoping that the situation will improve, and we'll be able to go back this year, maybe later this year, to do some of that work. So that's something that's on in the pipeline. And then out of those workshops, also it kind of became quite clear the importance of Indigenous fire management in terms of climate change. So you probably know that in Australia, for example, they've been trying to link Indigenous fire management with kind of climate change mitigation plans and so forth. And I suppose people around in different countries are kind of thinking about this. And so we managed to also do some more workshops. This was just in Venezuela, which was funded through the British Embassy in Caracas, on looking at climate change and bringing Indigenous leaders again to look at that. And one of the elements of that was fire as well, and fire management, and how Indigenous fire management could be fed into climate change mitigation policies and stuff like that, but in a more kind of grassroots kind of level. So something that comes from the Indigenous people rather than kind of devised by an expert sitting in Caracas or whatever it might be. So that's kind of like also happened, which was great. So
what's that look like? What does that connection between Indigenous fire and climate mitigation look like?
I suppose
just quickly.
I mean, if most Indigenous practices are, what they're doing in general is they're preventing large, intense, high intensity fires, basically, that emit a lot of greenhouse gases. So because they're doing kind of small patchy burning that prevents those kind of large scale catastrophic fires. So the idea is that by doing that kind of burning, you reduce CO2 emissions or other greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore you're reducing your kind of carbon footprint.
Okay, so it's kind of like a fire smart type situation. Like you're just removing all of the ladder fuels so that you're burning out the smaller stuff and you're leaving the bigger stuff. So if a wildfire does start in that area, the large stuff doesn't have an opportunity to catch on fire and emit a whole bunch of extra carbon. Okay.
Exactly. And it keeps to, like in Canada as well. It's funny, Jay, I wrote down climate change link on my paper. So you totally read my mind on like that, because in Canada, that's where all of our funding actually mostly has come for kind of revitalizing cultural burning, is through climate change funding. Yep. So that's like also then you keep the big trees, right, that then kind of suck up because what we're seeing too with climate change is that some forests in Canada aren't reestablishing. So before we used to always say that fires were carbon neutral, right, because they release they release kind of the carbon that they've sucked up when they burn, but then the forests grow back and they reabsorb that carbon. Right. But now we're seeing that some forests aren't growing back, like they're growing back different, or they're turning into kind of desert patches. Yeah. Gotcha. So then what does that mean for, contributions to climate So I was going to ask you too about in South America, like with the indigenous peoples there, are they seeing, like in Canada, we're seeing, climate change in real life here with like our, permafrost melt and our increase in fires and severe weather. What's it like in South America? Are they kind of having similar impacts?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, the kind of the incidence of more extreme events that they notice. So kind of longer droughts, not being able to predict when rain's coming, greater chance of forest burning because of that. Because, they would say, okay, in the past they would have set a fire here, it would have stopped at this point. Now it's going into the forest. So the forest is obviously drying as well, which is a phenomena that they probably, have noticed a lot. The drying of the forest as well, and it becoming more flammable because of kind of climate change. So it's definitely there. They see all these effects all the time. I think it's a big issue. But I was just going to say, I think one of the other things that I think can get lost, and I think has to be really kind of brought forward in the minds of particularly managers and institutions, is this. I'm sure you might have already read about, the climate change mitigation kind of policies and programs that have happened in Australia with Indigenous fire management, is not to forget that fire is not just a tool, but it's actually part of people's culture as well. And it's actually quite linked into every kind of bit of their culture. So, for example, if I go back to thinking about in South America, I've done some work with another group called the Kayapo in the Amazon basin, and a lot of their fire burning, savanna burning, is linked to cultural festivals that then play an integral role in the whole kind of fabric of their society, in terms of their food security, in terms of social relations, loads of different things. So actually, fire has much. It's not just a tool. Like you said before, you were saying about the difference between controlled and prescribed, and it's that kind of thing where it becomes something just functional and it's just a tool. Institutions perceive it like that, but actually, I think a lot of Indigenous people that I've worked with don't see it as a tool. It's a part of their life and it's a part of culture. And so, if you in the Australian case, it's almost like they're kind of there has been some studies that have said, or some people who have looked at it have said, well, are people there institutionalizing Indigenous fire management in some sort of way by bringing Indigenous management into the institution and therefore changing it? Because, for example, they're focusing a lot on early dry season burning, which they also did in Brazil too, when Brazil adopted a very similar model to Australia in some of the trials that they did over the last number of years. But the focus was very much on early dry season burning, because obviously if you do early dry season burning and you create the patchy landscape in the early dry season, you do then reduce the fuel load, and you're going to have less late dry season burns, which are the more intense burns and which will emit more greenhouse gases. And it's true, it does work, if you do that. But on the other hand, it's always important to remember that early dry season burning isn't the only burning that Indigenous people do. They do burning of lots of different types. So it's about supporting. That's such a great point. Supporting the whole fire calendar, what we'd call, because they have a fire calendar, which is actually the whole year round. They even burn in the wet season sometimes. So it's kind of supporting the whole fire calendar, because the whole fire calendar is based on their livelihoods and their culture. And they're kind of linked together.
Fantastic. Yeah, the one thing I've ranted on this podcast before, Matt's probably heard a little bit, but for me, as an Indigenous woman, I have a real concern about this new kind of interest in Indigenous fire from agencies, because what I've been seeing is almost that, kind of what universities and things tend to do is come to our communities and capture our knowledge and then take it and put it, use the pieces that they like, and then, kind of say that they're working with us on things. And so I have a real concern that Indigenous burning practices are going to be, taken from us basically, when to me, like you said, it's such an integral part of our life as a culture. I had someone say to me, because their caribou are really important to them. So they said, when the caribou die, we don't exist. And I've actually heard that too about burning. If we can't use fire, then we don't have a culture, because we can't do our cultural practices. And then it was funny too, because I was up in northern Saskatchewan and I was talking about cultural burning, and this little elder put up her hand at the back of the room and kind of said, like, what's cultural burning?
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, that's, you know, kind of if you do any burning to like for your cultural livelihood or to do cultural activities on the land. And she's like, oh, I don't do any of that cultural burning stuff. I just burn for berry patches, burn for sweat lodges, burn for religion, you know, like she went on this whole thing. But for her, like that idea of like, you know, cultural burning was a really strange, you know, almost kind of academic term. We're just giving it a name, aren't we?
We're just giving it a terminology that kind of fits with our kind of way of thinking. But yeah.
So but I think it's really a very, put it in perspective.
Yeah, but I think it's a really, really important point. And I think it's not just in terms of Indigenous fire management. I mean, I don't know if you saw, I'm sure you did, that there was the report that was released last month from the United Nations. And one of the big findings was that Indigenous people and local communities have sustainable practices, and we've got to learn from them basically, because they're going to help save the world and mass extinction of biodiversity. And yes, it's true. And we've been, you know, a lot of us have been talking about that for a long time. But, you know, as you said, it can't be another form of colonization by taking that knowledge. It's got to be on people's own terms, and it's got to be for the benefit of them too, you know. So it can't. Yeah,
what's that?
That's really important.
How do you draw that line between like sharing Indigenous knowledge with like Western society so that it can be incorporated into, you know, the management that they are trying to do, but also maintain that sovereignty from the Indigenous perspective so that it's not being taken from you, and it's, you know, it's them doing it, right? So it's, I don't know, it's such a complicated problem to try and solve. And like you said,
like for an average fire manager who sees that you need to burn on your land, how do you work then with Indigenous communities and not be seen as trying to steal their knowledge?
Well, that's just it, right? It could be somebody who's completely genuine in the Western, you know, fire culture that's trying to really wants to help, but they don't know how. Like these conversations, like about having that knowledge stripped and then incorporated without the Indigenous people being involved. It's not something that I think most fire managers would think of. Like it wouldn't come up to me. It would just be like, oh yeah, we're doing the right thing. We're helping them do their thing. We're doing what they want to be done. But they, you know what I mean? They might not understand that link to the cultural aspect of it. And it's hard to get in. But it ties into that whole, what you were just saying about that link to the link to nature, right? And that sustainability that comes with a lot of Indigenous cultures. And we seem to see ourselves as above nature and beyond it, and we just kind of extract what we need and don't worry about it, right? It's all about the economy and money and all this kind of stuff, and that's what the world we live in. But trying to get the rest of us on board with sustainability as like the number one priority, right? It's a tough one to try and figure out.
I think for me, what I personally always recommend is just that things need to be Indigenous led. So I don't know what Jay thinks about that, but if I hear of any, you know, prescribed burning research, anything like that, or Indigenous burning research doesn't have, you know, Indigenous people involved in it, leading it, to me, that's when I start to get a bit more worried. Or like if I see a community, like an agency that starts, you know, says, oh, we're going to do, you know, an Indigenous burn and this is how we're doing it and that, and they don't have any Indigenous people involved. It's like, you know, good attempt, but.
So people are trying, but it's just, I think there's something being lost about the heart of what cultural burning is, right? It's like we're doing the burning, but then the purpose of it is kind of lost on, besides the fact of fuel reduction and that kind of stuff.
I think there's an element of kind of you have to kind of give up control, isn't it? And I think what you were saying, Amy, right at the beginning about kind of power and who has the power, I think that's where the struggle is because I think you know, if you really want to do it properly and you want to do it Indigenous led, then it really means giving over power to other people. And I think a lot of, you know, government institutions or agencies or whatever, that's what is the sticking point there, is actually handing over the power to somebody else and having the trust in them to say, yes, they're going to be able to do this, you know. I think that
having the public have that same trust, right?
Yeah. And I think that, I mean, that's another issue too, whether the public also have that trust in someone to kind of do it for us. So, Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's hard, isn't it? Because a lot of, we give our trust in these politicians. I know that's another question altogether. Who don't always do the right job anyway. So why not give the trust to Indigenous people who, we've got evidence that they know what they're doing. So
yeah, I think that's the whole thing for me of colonization and how I've seen, changes not only in my family and nation, but in others is from going from really kind of more local problem solving to this whole idea of kind of centralized experts making the decision. And I think I've said it on this podcast before that, the whole kind of centralization of fire agencies in like, a city basically where they're not likely to experience fire, and then making decisions, for people who are forest-based communities that, live up in the north and trying to make decisions for them. I think that's a bit part of the problem. And I think it's just the whole structure of a colonial government is, that's kind of how your funding comes, who approves it, who gets permission on what to do on what type of land.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's also this kind of, some of the other work that I've been doing linked to fire, but also kind of in general, more kind of wider kind of conservation and natural resource management. It's this whole kind of idea of community owned solutions. So, we tend to, it's kind of exactly what you said there, Amy. It's kind of this thing that there's always this idea from institutions that local people don't actually know what they're doing, or that they don't really have the information that they need, or they're not educated or something like that. And I think we just need to turn that around. And maybe the first question we need to ask people in these communities is like, what are you doing here? That's really good. And what are you doing here? What can we learn from you? So instead of the kind of negative, it's kind of always go there with the positive and try to kind of, find out what the positive things are. I think that's part of the issues, that a lot of kind of external people go into these communities and they always go in with this kind of negative idea of that something's lacking, that they're deficient in something, rather than
low capacity. We always hear.
Rather than thinking about, what's all the really good positive things that this community has, or this group has, and what can we learn from there? And if things are challenging, then what can we do to help, rather than we have all the answers and you can listen to us kind of thing. So
yeah, that brings back, Jay, to one thing that I wanted to ask you about, because I know in some of your writing, it's talked about the parks and the exclusion of Indigenous people from suddenly these kind of national parks that have come up. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something that listeners to this may not know about, but it's something, that has occurred in Canada, in the US, in Australia, to Indigenous peoples that, were living kind of successfully in an area, managing it, and then suddenly got kicked out in the name of conservation. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering if you can just chat about that in South America and what you've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose South America is quite interesting. There's different countries in South America have kind of different rules in terms of how they kind of approach protected areas or national parks and areas of conservation. So kind of in Brazil, for example, they have areas of conservation where you don't have Indigenous people, and then you have Indigenous territories where there are like huge areas of land that are then collectively managed by the group who's given the land rights. But then you kind of go somewhere like Venezuela, where on paper it seems like the Indigenous people have lots of rights, but actually they don't have any rights to the kind of conservation areas and the national parks. So I think compared to some of the places like you hear about in Africa and in the African context, where people have actually been totally evicted from parks, you don't really, there isn't so much of that in South America, but there is a lot of issues in terms of people being able to continue doing the same practices that they were doing before. And, whether those are sustainable. So if you look in Venezuela, for example, in Cainama National Park, which is where my colleague Bibiana Bilbao's done a lot of her work, in that park, again, they stopped Indigenous people from burning in the parks. So they kind of stopped those kind of traditional activities because they thought they were kind of degrading the ecosystem. And it was kind of like impacting biodiversity. So yeah, there has been a lot of these kind of policies that have been counter to kind of Indigenous way of life or Indigenous practices in the name of conservation. But then, But now research is kind of showing that actually it's those kind of practices that also do maintain biodiversity by creating these kinds of, diverse microhabitats and so forth.
That's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a similar problem to here, right? Like we were just seeing, we have more of a homogeneous forest landscape than what supposedly is supposed to be there, like the mosaic type where you've got lots of edge and lots of different biodiversity. So yeah, it's interesting to note that the same things are kind of, I mean, politically it's different in every kind of person we talk to, from every location, but the same issues come up. This, you know what I mean? It's all the same.
Yeah,
it's all
colonization is pretty international.
No kidding, right? Like it's
yeah.
It's interesting to note that. Yeah.
Well, even just the fire thing, like how did we go from people, even settlers, using fire all over to suddenly fire exclusion? And it's, a horrible thing to use fire. And now 80 years later, we're in kind of a bit of a crunch here.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, Jay, what's coming up for you in the future? You said you're probably going back to Venezuela to do some work there?
Yeah, so in terms of fire, I'm actually... have a new project that's just started this year. So basically, with Royal Holloway, the university that I work at, with 3 other universities as part of London area, and it's led by one of the colleges, Imperial College. So we won a kind of £10 million grant from an organisation called the Leverhulme Trust. Yeah, it's an organisation called the Leverhulme Trust here in the UK, and they've funded what is, I should say, the Centre for Wildfires, Environment and Society. And this is going to be like an international centre that's going to be doing research on wildfires globally. And we're going to be working kind of like fire in the north, fire in the tropics, fire in the boreal forests, and then kind of global systems linked to kind of climate models and all of that kind of stuff. And yeah, I'm very excited. We got funded in January, and we're going to kind of kick off in the autumn. And we're going to have lots of different projects all around the world focusing on different aspects. And one of the things I'll be kind of focusing on, my kind of role in this centre, will be kind of looking at Indigenous fire management, and local community fire management as well, and how that can be brought more into kind of like complementing kind of scientific data. How can that knowledge also help in terms of looking at some of the fire models, some of the climate models, etc. So yeah, so that's something that I'm going to be, and it's a 10-year project. So we've been funded for 10 years. So it's really nice because it's quite long term. So we're going to have a lot of kind of postdocs and PhD students starting to do projects around. So I have one hopefully starting in September that's going to look at Indigenous fire management and protected areas in Guyana. So that should be happening. So yeah, so quite rosy looking in terms of fire and fire research at least for the next 10 years anyway. So
that's great. And I'm really glad to hear that you're leading that too, Jay, just with all your experience in this area and working in it. Like, I think that you guys are doing fantastic work in South America, really putting the Indigenous communities first and giving them a voice there that you don't often hear. So yeah, anyways, congratulations. It's really exciting.
Yeah, no, it's really great. And I'm really hoping that we're going to, be able to really push the idea. And, it was interesting that I think Matt was saying before that, it's a lot of the same kind of themes come out of, talking to different people from around the world. And I think it's a really good moment to kind of bring that all together and really make a good case for Indigenous fire management by using all that kind of that information coming from different parts of the world. In a way, we can pull that together, hopefully, and show how important Indigenous fire management and fire knowledge is just for, managing the environment in general and thinking about climate change and so forth.
For sure.
But hopefully in a more kind of, a way that is more kind of more a decolonial kind of methodology, decolonial kind of ways of working with Indigenous people.
Yeah, that's awesome.
No, that's perfect. That's exactly what I hope to see in the future here. Because it seems like, there's a lot of stuff going on, but there's still a long ways to go for sure to see that come back onto the landscape in a meaningful and helpful way.
Yeah, well, Australia is really leading in this
Yeah.
area, but even there, like, I mean, we've talked to people from Australia on this podcast, and there's issues as well with the power struggles and everything. So I think, yeah, like you said, the more evidence we can get, the more Indigenous people participating in like the whole just general field of fire management is going to make a big difference.
Well, and hopefully to try to empower some of these Indigenous communities to feel they have a say. They can speak up, and they can, you know what I mean, try and get involved somehow, so that, because it is important, right?
Yeah.
But I think that's part of the problem, right? They don't feel that trust, which I don't blame them.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, when, you know, it also comes down to things like land tenure and land rights, because, you know, land is what a lot of Indigenous people, that is their life, isn't it? And their knowledge is based on the land and stuff. So it's kind of ensuring that they also have rights to land as well. I think that's almost like the basis of getting things going. That's really important. So kind of helping groups to think, you know, to work towards that and show that actually, you know, when Indigenous people have rights to land, and they then apply their practices and their management on that it does maintain biodiversity and reduce greenhouse gases and maintain carbon and forest or whatever it is. So
yeah, I think that's a bit of the fear here, is that, you know, if suddenly, because here we have most of Canada is Crown land, which, you know, we feel as Indigenous people that it's actually our Indigenous territories.
Yes.
And so there's this whole thing, you know, that if we start coming off the reserves that lots of Indigenous people live on and burning in the territory, then, like you said, does then that give us land rights to that area? Because we personally believe it's our inherent right to that land. So anyways, it's interesting. And I think that that's where the whole power dynamic and everything comes in. It's not about fire as much. It's about, you know, who owns what. And
Correct.
Yeah.
And especially when you might have other kinds of resources on that land too, you know, whether, you know, certain governments want, you know, like you look in Brazil, for example. So one of the communities that we worked in, it's called Raposa Serra do Sol, which is in the kind of northern part of Brazil, close to Guyana, and they got their land rights a number of years ago after fighting for decades against illegal squatting by large farmers, rice farmers on their land. They managed to evict these farmers off the land, managed to get their land rights, but their territory contains a lot of minerals and other kinds of resources. And so the current government is now saying that, well, actually, you know, we may have the right to overturn some of these rights to get onto the land to get those resources. So, yeah, it's complicated.
For sure.
Especially when that industrial machine decides it's time to get theirs.
Yeah, the economy is always on everyone's mind.
Yeah, it's weird that as human beings we just have we have amnesia when it comes to like what's good for us. Like we don't understand that. Like we just seem to think that, like, well, we can just take what's ours and then we'll move on. It's like, well, at some point you run out of planet.
Yeah.
And we need to start working sustainably together towards a common future, because like you all said, like it's this is good for everybody, right? I mean, you were speaking earlier about the different values that like Western society might value, like say it's timber or I don't know, hunting populations or fish populations or whatever it might be, or water, right? They might have a different way of managing that, and that's where you run into those problems. But I guess if we started to integrate this, you know, that type of a management style, the Indigenous type of management style, and I don't know, it feels like the sustainability portion from the Western society aspect is missing a giant piece.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that piece is that kind of Indigenous perspective of the holistic viewpoint, right? Instead of viewing each researcher doing, you know, oh, I just researched just this grizzly bear or just this soil microbe, and trying to tie that whole thing together, right?
Yeah.
It's I don't know. I think it's
No, yeah, I know what you're trying to say. Because I think for me as an Indigenous person, like I see myself as part of the natural system, and I see the natural system as my relatives, right? So trees, animals, those things. And I think that that's the one thing, like you said, the sustainability or industry kind of sustainability conversation is missing, is that they see themselves as a bit separate from that.
Yeah.
So yeah, like a
Western culture in general does.
Like
right?
a perfectly healthy forest would be one that doesn't involve humans.
Right.
Whereas for me, that's not what would be you know, like that's just kind of that Western perspective.
Well, that's a crazy conversation to have, because like you hear that all the time. Like I've heard like very Stephen Ranella is one very famous conservationist. He's all in the hunting community and that kind of stuff. And he said many times, he's like, I think I would be okay with there being a giant swath of land that's totally preserved, like, you know, in quotations, but I can't go into it and no one can ever go in. I'd be okay with that. I'm like, well, that doesn't make sense though, because the problem is we're part of that that ecosystem as well, right? So you're missing another piece and you're creating another unstable situation, right? Somehow, how the hell did we come to think that we're different than nature, as if we're not from it, right? And we've said this before, but it's weird that we have this complex that we're somehow better than.
I was going to say, I think you both hit it on the nail. I mean, you know, when I think about my experiences with kind of Indigenous people, not just fire management, but just kind of other kinds of bits of conservation, whatever, I suppose there are kind of two aspects. One is definitely the kind of connectedness aspect that Amy was talking about, and how they see themselves completely connected within the whole system of you know, the kind of physical ecosystem, but also the kind of the non-human spiritual part of the system as well, that's also out there in nature as well. So it's a kind of really kind of intimately connected system, but also this idea, I think, also of kind of collectiveness, and that they're all in it therefore together, and that they're connected, you know, as a collective, not just in the time now, but from their ancestors and also the future people coming after them. So there's that kind of, you know, that kind of connectedness, collectiveness aspect, I think, that we probably have, and I say we, I'm talking about kind of maybe how we call it Western society, I don't know what to name it, have kind of lost that. It's not just the connectedness, but I think we've also lost the collectiveness idea, that actually we're all in it together, and that if something happens somewhere, it's going to affect somebody else down the line somewhere else. And that we should care about it as well, because, you know, we should care for other people and other things. So
it's very us versus them mentality. I mean, especially politically, right? So trying to get us all back to one square, which is the human race.
Sure. Which I think we can learn from Indigenous people, because that's the way they think. That's their kind of worldview. So
I agree.
And I see as bad as things are politically, like in Canada and other places, like for dividing people, I do see movements like that where people are becoming united and becoming concerned about the climate crisis and, you know, where we're going. So maybe
there's hope. There's hope.
In the future, there's hope. There has to be.
I think we've got, it's going back to that positive thing, you know, that we were talking about before. I think we've got to be positive and showcase the positive stories. I think that's the only way that we can kind of move forward. So
and that's why it's been great to have you on here chatting about the work that you're doing in South America too. So thanks so much, Jay.
No problem. It was great. Thank you very much as well.
Thanks a lot for listening, guys. That concludes the series that we've started, and the season 1, I suppose. And who knows? Maybe there'll be a season 2.
Maybe,
We're hoping for it. There's a lot of interest, so hopefully it'll come out. I think it's interesting to note all that stuff, that everything we talked about was all so interconnected. Like, it didn't matter if you were in Australia or if you're in Brazil or if you were in Canada or the States. It was all a lot of the same problems, right? Like certain places like Australia are a little bit more advanced in getting Indigenous fire back on the landscape and the importance of it, and getting the community involved, or the public involved. And then it's sad to see, hear places like Brazil having so much more resistance to that. But
even in Canada, it's been slow. Like we're not that, great either here, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But
but there's strides in the right direction, right? Like we're moving in the right direction. And it's good to see that people are actually starting to pay attention, and starting to recognize the importance of this, not just for Indigenous people, but for, the human race, for nature, for the environment, for climate change, for biodiversity, for all these different things, right?
Yeah.
And I hope that I have hope that we're heading in the right direction. You know what I mean? I'm like, I tend to be pretty positive about, humans, we eventually figure it out. One generation dies out that's kind of bigoted, and the next one comes in, figures it out, fixes that one problem, and then we keep moving forward, right? So I believe that we're going to figure it out. It's just in what timeline, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, and we're if we decide to do another series too, to document more stories about good things that are going on that people are doing. So yeah, if you have an idea, if you're working in your community in Indigenous fire and you want to get some more people hearing about it, contact either me or Matt and let us know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What email do you want to send out? That's the question.
Yeah. Right? Google me. No, just kidding.
Yeah, you can contact me at yourforestpodcast@gmail.com. That's my personal podcast email. And then Amy, you can probably her contact comes up on the government website. So
yeah. So yeah, it's a long one. But yeah, amy.christensen@canada.ca is good. But yep.
So it's awesome to hear all the good stuff that's going on out there. And thank you to all the guests that came on. We appreciate you taking the time to do this. It was really, really cool. I learned a lot being totally not from this world. So having the, that purely environmental perspective, and that, on my part to learning about the cultural side of it and the importance, and then the importance of all of that for the rest of society was really, it was really cool.
Yeah. And thanks to all, I want to say my colleagues who came forward, but also the one thing about Indigenous fire is we're all friends too. It's a very small world. So thanks to them, for stepping up when I cold called them about this podcast and trusting us, to share their ideas.
How many did you have to bully?
Yeah, just Trent. Just kidding. Okay.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, guys. And keep subscribed to this podcast because you never know when you might have more stuff coming out. So thanks a lot, guys. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot for listening, guys. This podcast was produced by me, Matthew Christoph, and I have an environmental sciences podcast called Your Forest. And if you like good fire, you'll definitely like Your Forest. Please check it out on Apple, Google, Spotify, and Stitcher. And I hope you guys like it. Thanks a lot for listening. Take it easy.